This week in racing, we're going to talk about the Fernando to IndyCar hype train. Has it finally been derailed once and for all? We're also going to talk about the Hypercar regulations for Le Mans in 2021 and why they're going to suck. And finally, we're going to be discussing the possibility of NASCAR hosting an exhibition race in the land down under. Lots of stuff to talk about. Let's get into it. And we start out with the answer to one of the burning questions of this offseason in IndyCar racing. Where will Ed Jones go? Well, we found out this week that Ed Jones will take over the road course driving duties for the number 20 Fuzzy's Vodka Chevrolet for Ed Carpenter Racing. Now, interestingly enough, that means that Jordan King is out of the seat, but also interesting is that Scuderia Corsa will associate themselves with this particular entry. They were associated previously with Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing, and they fielded Oriol Servia in this year's Indianapolis 500. Now, this deal involves Ed Jones running a third car at the Indianapolis 500 that will be prepared by Scuderia Corsa. Of course, Ed Carpenter, Team Ed as it's called, will handle the driving duties for car number 20 on the oval tracks and will take that car running in the Indianapolis 500. Jones will run an Ed Carpenter hybrid with Scuderia Corsa. That car number will be number 64, like it was last year with the Rahal team. And then Spencer Pigot, of course, will be the full-time driver in car number 21. Now, the question that kind of remains out there, and certainly it's good to see Ed Jones get a seat. I know a lot of people were speculating about where he would go. I speculated Carlin. Turns out that's wrong. Looks like the three drivers at that team, if it turns into a three-car team, are going to be Marcus Ericsson, Max Chilton, and Charlie Kimball. But we're going to be looking at where where Jordan King will end up for next season. Where could he be? I think the most likely scenario, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you are a fan of the World Endurance Championship, is that he will go to the World Endurance Championship. That seems to be a place where we see a lot of Mark Blundell's clients. We saw Mike Conway go there after a bit of a career rehabilitation at Ed Carpenter Racing. Now, do I think Jordan King will end up in a factory LMP1? Probably not. I could see him in an LMP2, kind of like what we see Mikhail Aloshin doing at the particular moment. I could see him going full-time in IndyCar. I know Jordan King tested at the Oval at Phoenix and seems interested in running a full season, particularly running the Indy 500. I don't see, especially in this offseason where there's so many people looking for rides and so many people with cash on hand to get a ride, I don't see exactly where he would slot in. I know some people have said Carlin. Again, I think it's going to be Kimball, Chilton, and Ericsson at that team, or some combination of those three drivers. So I think Jordan King probably out of IndyCar, but he has been somewhat impressive this season, no doubt about it. He certainly was fast at St. Petersburg and certainly fast at several other road courses this season. The results just didn't come because of unfortunate circumstances. I remember specifically at the Grand Prix of Indianapolis, he was taken out at the first corner and never really recovered from that. So it'll be interesting to see where Jordan King goes, and it's good for Ed Jones. I think it's a good career move. I think his career, much like Mike Conway's and other drivers, will be somewhat rehabilitated by going here. I think he'll impress. I think the pressure will be off because he won't be teammates with Scott Dixon this time. He'll be teammates with a similar, or driver of similar experience and talent level there with Spencer Pigot. So I think that's going to be a good team going into next year, and I think Jones is really going to thrive. Oh yeah, speaking of IndyCar next year, McLaren ain't going to be in it. This week, this Friday, Zak Brown of McLaren confirmed that McLaren will not be a full-time participant in next year's IndyCar season. Now, what's interesting about this is that he said the time simply ran out to make this deal happen, but a part-time schedule is not off the table, and the Indy 500 is a probability. Now, that would either be, or at least what was said by Zak Brown, is that if an Indy 500 effort or a partial season effort by McLaren next year in IndyCar would be with Fernando Alonso. Now, that's interesting because at this time, Fernando Alonso is a free agent for all intents and purposes, and we really need to look at him as that. And that's kind of the thing that I think a lot of people are missing about this is that a lot of people are joining McLaren and Alonso at the hip. And I think you're right partially for thinking that. I think McLaren is much more tied to Alonso in terms of IndyCar than Alonso is tied to McLaren in terms of IndyCar. And what I mean by that, without doing too many mental gymnastics, because I find that a lot of this Fred Watch stuff has been mental gymnastics, trying to figure out exactly where everything is going. So I'm going to try not to do too much of it in this. But I think we need to look at Fernando, like I said, like a free agent. So is there a possibility, or we know now that McLaren is not going to be full-time in IndyCar next year. Okay, that's confirmed. Do we know that Fernando is not going to be full-time in IndyCar next year? No. Okay? Until it comes out of Fernando's mouth, you can't believe it. So we've got to look at what we've got. And what we've got is a guy who seems very interested in running IndyCar next year, but we also have to look at some of the obstacles here. And one of the obstacles, the major one, it seems at the moment, and it may be part of the reason why McLaren isn't here this year, is because of the engine supply issue. Will Honda be interested in supplying Fernando Alonso? Were they interested in supplying McLaren? Were they not interested in supplying McLaren? We do know also, through the reporting of Marshall Pruitt, that there was the potential that the Harding Racing team, which now is the Harding-Steinbrenner Racing team, which is going to have 2 rookies next year, Colton Herta and Patricio O'Ward, that would have been the place that McLaren would have gone if they had been able to get this program together for whatever roadblock stood in their way. Other people, like I think this has been going all the way back to June, is that the McLaren board hasn't particularly been on board with this particular idea by Zak Brown. So a Chevy-powered 2-car team, they couldn't get it done. So it makes me think to a certain extent that it wasn't necessarily an engine supply issue. I think the board theory, the board members putting a stop to it, at least for now, seems like it would make sense. But I think you'd have to be a fool, especially if you're on the McLaren board, to not see the benefit to doing this. But I agree if at least the board's thinking is, we need to put it off for a little while. We need to get our F1 program stabilized and then move forward with other racing programs after that. I think if they say, well, we don't want to do it at all, that would be very surprising and I think a short-sighted move. Indy 500. Let's talk specifically about McLaren, then we'll go into Alonso. So Indy 500, you've got to think it's going to be with Andretti if they do it. And you've got to also think that it would be with Fernando Alonso if they do it. Do you see any possibility, and I don't think I can, where McLaren is at Indy and Fernando is not with them? I mean, I just don't see any driver, unless there's some real screwy stuff going on. Let's say, for example, Fernando runs Indy for a different team, or he's running the full season with Andretti in a 5th car. So would McLaren sponsor Fernando's car, or would the McLaren team actually bring in a different driver, let's say, just for the sake of argument, a Stephen Wilson to run that car? I mean, there's so many possibilities up in the air with all of this that, you look at it and you just don't know where it's going. And that's kind of what we've kind of gotten at this point. And it seems to always be the discussion when we're talking about Alonso and IndyCar. Now, an extra wrinkle to all of this, and something I found very interesting, and I should have reported on it last week, was the fact that Fernando Alonso has bought, apparently according to a few reports, has purchased the TV rights, the television rights to IndyCar racing in his native Spain. Now, that wouldn't strike me as the move that someone would make when they're not thinking about going full-time in IndyCar racing, unless the rights, the TV rights to his Indy 500 run, a Triple Crown attempt, is valuable enough to Fernando alone that he was willing to make the investment and take the plunge and take over the full rights to the IndyCar TV deal in Spain. That could be very interesting. And apparently, it's something he learned from Flavio Briatore, who actually, I believe, bought the Spanish TV rights when he brought Fernando Alonso to Renault. And that ended up bringing a sizable amount of money once Fernando started winning his world championships, because suddenly he was a national hero in Spain and everybody was tuning in, and TV companies were bidding high dollars to see Fernando Alonso race in F1. So I don't know. I think, and I think I even said this in the Harding-Steinbrenner thing, I think what we're going to see next year, I still am holding out a little bit of hope that I think Fernando's still going to be full-time in IndyCar racing next year. And a lot of people have talked about a date clash in WEC with Portland next year, but I keep in mind that Fernando, especially if he wins the World Championship come Le Mans next year, he will have accomplished everything he can possibly accomplish in WEC. He's already won Le Mans. He's got that Triple Crown rung on his belt. And once the end of the season comes, will he be willing to re-up for another super season of WEC competition? I don't think he will. So anything past Le Mans in terms of a conflict with IndyCar and WEC, I think is irrelevant. I think he's going to be in IndyCar next year. I think it'll be full-time. I think it'll be with a fifth Andretti car. Will McLaren come in some capacity next year? I think only if Fernando is not full-time. So, in other words, if Fernando is full-time, McLaren won't be here. If Fernando is part-time or an Indy 500 only driver, we'll see McLaren a la what we saw in 2017. I don't think we'll see a full season Fernando and a partial season McLaren, though that would be the best case scenario, I think, at this current juncture. But I think that's where I'm going to shoot my shot at the particular moment with all the information that we have. We'll see if it works out. So we had some concrete details of the 2021 regulations for the 24 hours of Le Mans and the World Endurance Championship. They're called the Hypercars, and they will be hybrid GT cars. There will be no testing or no access to the cars during the season, which is an interesting way of putting the fact that I guess the cars will be impounded between the rounds in the championship. There will also be very limited testing during the season. 2 cars will be required to be entered by any team that decides to enter this Le Mans Hypercar regulation era. There will also be a cost cap of 2 million euros for, I would assume, developing the cars or in-season cost. God only knows how they're going to enforce that. And there will also be a single tire supplier. So spec tires have made their way to Le Mans. So this is going to absolutely suck. This is a bad idea. Very bad idea. I guess I should say as well that this hypercar formula is supposedly, or supposed to be, the replacement for what we currently know as LMP1. Wow. Okay, so there's a lot to break down here. And I guess I'll start by saying this. This is history repeating itself 101. In the early 90s, the Group C regulations had just introduced a new formula. This is going to start sounding very familiar, by the way. From a current, or an era of Group C racing that was very popular. It was based on fuel restrictions. Then they moved away from that. They moved to a formula that was very much based on Formula 1 engines, V10 and V8 engines that were very powerful and very expensive. The cars also became very expensive. Is this sounding familiar? You could probably change a few things around and insert different names and consonants and whatnot and get the same meaning out of this. Ultimately, there ended up being at Le Mans only one factory team, Peugeot. Sound familiar? One factory team, Toyota. So what do the rules makers do as car counts were dwindling and it looked like prototype racing was going the way of the dodo? The brain trust at the FIA actually left sports car racing. This got so bad. So the ACO introduced what we now know as the GT1 regulations. Now, this was supposed to be a kind of revitalization of the 60s, 70s, or 60s and early 70s, where you had true GT cars like the GT40 going out there and racing for overall wins. there was only ever one true GT car, at least in my kind of perception of it, that won Le Mans. It was 1995 with the McLaren F1. By the time GT1 cars were actually winning the race, they were either thinly veiled Group C cars like the Dower 962 that won in 1994, or stuff like the Porsche GT1, which, if you consider that a GT car, I've got a bridge to sell you in New Jersey. And ultimately, the cost rose to such an extent, and manufacturers got so tricky with it, like Toyota with their GT1, that really, ultimately, the FIA or the ACO eventually looked at it and said, well, why don't we just go back to prototypes? So here we are. History is repeating itself, and the FIA has decided they want to have GT cars be the top class at Le Mans. But they also want to be very restrictive about it, even to the extent that 2 million euros, that's not very much money when we're talking about a racing program. Good God. For 2 cars, by the way. It's not 2 million euros a car. It's 2 million euros for 2 cars, which is the required entry. Privateers in the top class at Le Mans pretty much killed by this. I don't see any scenario where anybody but a manufacturer would be interested in this. And then there's the question of which manufacturers are going to be interested in this. Toyota, we know they have a hypercar concept that they've built. Would they be the only entry? We're right back where we started. I can't see this being anything but 2, 4, 6 cars at most. Where are the privateers going to come from? I know Brabham, David Brabham, Brabham Automotive is looking at building one of these. That program, I'm going to be honest, has always felt like vaporware to me. I think they crowdfunded something for an LMP2 car. That never happened. So there's a lot of things that stink about this. And I've also got to ask, if you wanted the GT cars to be the top class at Le Mans, I'm pretty sure there's a class for that already, and it's a pretty darn good class, and you have a lot of manufacturers heavily invested in it. It's called GTE Pro. So why, if GTE or GT cars are your ultimate goal here, why not just make GTE the top class, get rid of prototypes altogether, and have GTE AM become kind of the second class where the privateers go and race? It doesn't make any sense to me. And, there's also like BOP in this particular series. It looks like they're going to be managing the pace of these cars. They're really going to try to manage development costs. This is going to be not a good thing. It's really going to be poor. I'm going to shoot my shot and say this is not going to. And here's the worst part about this is that in America, the United States of America, we've pretty much got a better formula for this already. It's called DPI. Now, is DPI perfect? No. Is there room to improve DPI to make it a more appealing international product? Absolutely. But the manufacturer involvement, the availability of the cars to a certain extent, you can't deny it. So it's going to be the unfortunate reality of the French governing body doesn't want to accept that an American governing body maybe took their concept and did it a little bit better before they did. And it's a shame, because I think Le Mans is really going to suffer for the next couple of years because of these regulations. And, God forbid those cars are unreliable, then we've got an LMP2 winner. That didn't even happen in the LMP1 era, at least until next year. We'll have to wait and see. But, yeah, I don't see how this is going to work. I hate the fact that Le Mans is starting to make things spec, and cost caps in racing, they're not going to work. They're never going to work. There's no way somebody is going to find a way to get around this. You can impound the cars all you want. It's a bad idea. It's gonna end ugly, and it's a shame. And finally, NASCAR in Australia. Is there a possibility? Well, there's some talk. Scott McLaughlin, old Giverson Jandal, was driving a Team Penske stock car from 2016 at Surfers Paradise, Australia, the old street circuit that IndyCars used to use, if you're familiar with that. And what's interesting that came of this, not only the fact that Scott McLaughlin had a great time, but there's some talk that there might be a possible NASCAR expansion race or an exhibition race in Australia somewhere, somehow. Now, Australia did have its own NASCAR series in the mid-90s, but that didn't last for very long. And certainly the Australians are quite interested in stock car racing. That's pretty much what V8 Supercars are. Maybe you could call it touring car racing, but I think it's a little more closely related to stock car racing. That may get me some hate. Regardless, there are already a lot of NASCAR people associated with V8 Supercars, or at least there has been some crossover in the past. You look at Marcus Ambrose coming over for a few years. Team Penske, obviously this is how this all took place, is over there and owning a team along with Dick Johnson. So there's interest, there's crossover. I think it's going to fall on the shoulders of NASCAR, whether or not they want to do an exhibition race. They really haven't done one since the 90s when NASCAR was kind of putting its toe in the water, thinking about expanding into Japan. They ran a couple races at Twin Ring Motegi as well as Suzuka. I think this is a good idea. I think it could be a lot of fun. I know, again, NASCAR is desperate for variety. They're desperate for things to be interesting and fun again. Doing a street circuit in Australia, particularly on the Gold Coast, where again they're familiar with American-style racing and there is a bit of a thirst for it. I think it could work. I think a street circuit would be absolutely. It would be like the Roval. Don't get me wrong. There would be a lot of cars in the wall, but I think it'd be a lot of fun. And I think the fun aspects of NASCAR is what they should, and I think they are trying to focus on going forward. So what do you think? What do you think about all of this? Jordan King. Yeah, remember that? We talked about that earlier. Also, Fernando Alonso. Man, I bet you've already typed a comment about Fernando Alonso. And what about the Hypercars? Again, I'm totally not thinking that that's going to work. Regardless, that's been This Week in Racing. What did you think of it? If you did enjoy this, got to the end, my God, you are a fan. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and like it if you did. This has been David Land on YouTube. Again, subscribe for more motorsport, F1, IndyCars, V8 Supercars, NASCAR, sports car content, and we'll see you in the next video.